What's going on, guys? Kalipis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. This is pros and cons for the T-Mobile Revvl V Plus 5G. In this video, we're going to be going over some of the strengths and weaknesses of this phone. Now, before we go any further, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It helps out the channel a lot. But with that out of the way, let's get into the video. So my first pro for this phone is the battery. This phone has a really large battery at 5,000 milliamp hours, and it also supports 18 watt fast charging. So not only are you getting a really huge battery, but you're also getting some of the best fast charging you can find in a phone in this price range. So that is really good. Having a large battery like this means you're not only gonna get a ton of life throughout the day and not have to charge your phone as much, but you're also gonna get that longevity down the road. So over time, as the battery starts to degrade, its performance isn't really gonna be affected as quickly as you might see with a smaller battery. So as a result, you'll be able to keep the phone for much longer without actually having to replace it. And as for the fast charging, pretty self-explanatory. If you have fast charging, it's gonna charge up the phone a lot faster. So if you don't have a lot of time to wait for your phone to charge up, this is gonna help out a lot. My second pro for this phone is the processor. This phone is getting 4 gigabytes of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor. I ran a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and it came back with a single core score of 541 and a multi-core score of 1692. Not only is this really impressive for a phone in this price range, but it's also really impressive in general. To put this into perspective, back in 2017, 2018, flagship phones actually had processing power around this same level. Now, by today's standards, this is nowhere near flagship level. Today's flagship phones like the Samsung Galaxy S21 Ultra and the iPhone 12 Pro Max have over double this. But compared to the older flagship phones, this phone is actually really competitive, which just goes to show how good of a processor this phone has. In this price range with this much processing power, you're getting a ton of value out of this. Whether you're just browsing the web and going on social media, or you're playing a higher end game or maybe video editing, some of those super high-end tasks like playing Fortnite or something might struggle just a little bit, but with everything else, you're gonna have such a good experience, especially compared to the average phone in this price range. Around this range, you could compare it to something like the Samsung Galaxy A12, and the multi-core score of this phone is actually almost double that of the Samsung Galaxy A12. So that really just goes to show that difference. Even if you're only using your phone for basic activities, it's gonna be so much faster on this phone that in general, if processing power is a priority for you, this is gonna be one of the best, if not the best option you can go for in this price range. My third pro for this phone is that it has NFC. NFC, in case you don't know what it is the technology behind contactless mobile payment services like Google Pay, Apple Pay, all that. And without NFC, you can't use those services. And being that they're getting more and more widely used by the day, I think NFC is a really important feature to have in your phone. Even if you don't currently use it, it's nice to know that you have the option to in the future if you ever change your mind. And unfortunately, even though I think that that feature should be in pretty much every phone now, it's really not. In fact, phones much more expensive than this one still don't have NFC, so it's really nice that this phone does. My fourth pro for this phone is the large display. At 6.82 inches, this phone's display is definitely on the larger side, and it's among one of the largest displays you can currently get. That's going to give you a much better experience with content consumption as opposed to a phone that has a smaller display, simply because things are going to show up a lot bigger on here, making them easier to see. So whether you're streaming a video, viewing photos, playing a game, even reading, this display is going to be great for that. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't have a 1080p display or anything like that, but I do think the size alone really does make up for that. My fifth pro for this phone is the storage. This phone has 64 gigabytes of internal storage with microSD card expansion. Now that's not an insane amount by any means. It really isn't. There are plenty of phones out there that have 128 gigabytes that are just a little bit more expensive than this one, sometimes even in the same price if we're talking about the blue phones. But considering all the other features this phone has and the price range, I do think the storage is pretty good. With 64 gigabytes, for the average user, you're really not going to need much more than that. especially with so many other options like cloud storage, micro SD card expansion, all that stuff. The only time you're really gonna explicitly need more storage on your phone is if you have a ton of apps and app data and that sort of thing, or if you don't like using stuff like Google Drive or micro SD cards or anything like that, then maybe you'd be better off going for a phone that has 128 gigabytes. But other than that, for the typical everyday user, you're probably not even going to use up all 64 gigabytes. So now that we've gone over some of the good things about this phone, let's talk about some of the not so good things. So my first con for this phone is the RAM. Now, even though the processor is really good, it's a real fast phone, all that kind of stuff, it only has 4 gigabytes of RAM, and with a MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor, especially compared to other phones with that processor, or even just with a similar processor that has a similar amount of power, typically they have around 6 gigabytes of RAM instead, and I do think that would make a big difference with this phone. Having extra RAM means it's going to be able to handle more stuff like multitasking, or simply a higher performance task like playing something like Fortnite, maybe editing a video, something like that. Now, it's really not a big deal, and this is being super nitpicky because after all, phones like the iPhone 12 that have an insane amount of processing power and do things insanely fast, some of those phones only have 4 gigabytes of RAM too, so there's a lot that goes into it. But I do think in this specific situation, having just a couple gigabytes more RAM in this phone would actually make a difference. My second con for this phone is the display quality. Now, although the display itself is really big, and that does make content consumption in general better, it would be nice if it had a 1080p display. Now, that in this price range isn't really very common to begin with, but the OnePlus Nord N200 5G, which I also covered and compared to this phone on the channel, actually has a 1080p display, and not only that, but it has a 90Hz 1080p display, which means all the movement on the display is going to be a lot faster and smoother than it would be on a phone like this that only has a 60Hz display. So although this display is much larger than the average phone in this price range, having a higher resolution and potentially a higher refresh rate would make the experience just that much better. My third con for this phone is the overall design. Now, one of the drawbacks of having such a large display is that it makes the phone really bulky. The corners are also pretty sharp, giving it this square look that I'm not a big fan of. The bezels are a little bit on the thicker side, especially this bottom one right here. And there's a water drop notch, which I'm not a big fan of this look. I think the hole punch camera that lots of other manufacturers have nowadays is so much better. So overall, I do think if they fix this kind of thing, it would help a lot. And just because the display is large doesn't mean the phone has to be this bulky. For example, the Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G has almost the exact same display size, and that phone is really sleek and really comfortable to hold in your hand and to carry in your pocket. So I know it can be done, they just need to work on this design a little bit, and it's gonna look a lot nicer and more modern. My fourth con for this phone is the features in general. Now, this phone has some real nice specs, I will give it that, but its features otherwise are a little bit disappointing. Although it has some stuff like a screen recorder, it doesn't have any alternate ways to take a screenshot, and its gesture features are pretty weak. In case you don't know what I'm talking about, let's take a look. So in the settings menu, if we go down to system and go to gestures, in a lot of other phones in this price range, there are usually tons of different features, but here we only have a few options. There's really very little we can do with the gestures. Like I said, there's no alternate way to take a screenshot. There is tap to wake and lift to wake, which for some weird reason is in the display menu, and a few other things, but overall, most phones, like for example, the OnePlus Nord N200 5G, which is probably the most similar phone to this in this price range, that phone has so many more gestures than this one, and so do many others like the Samsung phones, and even Motorola phones. So in general, I do think they could improve on the other features like gestures and settings in general to make the user experience of this phone a little bit more interesting. My fifth and final con for this phone is that there's no wireless charging. Now this isn't very surprising, but I'm still counting it as a con either way. First of all, because this is such a good phone and I really couldn't find a whole lot that I don't like about it. And second of all, it is just so annoying that pretty much no phone that's not a flagship phone doesn't have wireless charging. It's not that complicated of a feature, definitely not more complicated than NFC, which lots of phones do have, so I really don't get why manufacturers can't just put that feature on pretty much every phone in existence now. It's such a useful feature that lots of people don't even think about until they're in a situation where they could use it. For example, extra battery packs. Say you're on a vacation somewhere and your phone starts to die when you're being a tourist walking around somewhere. If you don't have wireless charging, you're gonna have to get one of those archaic phone cases that's extremely ridiculously bulky and plug that into your phone, or even worse, some sort of battery pack that has a cord. Either way, it's super inconvenient versus the higher end phones like the Samsung Galaxy S21 Ultra or the iPhone 12 Pro Max, where you can simply just pop on a magnetic battery pack and it instantly starts charging the phone. That's so much better. And if phones in this price range had that type of feature, it would be a huge advantage for everyone. In addition to that, if something happens to your charging port, the phone is basically useless. But if you had wireless charging, you might be able to get a little bit more use out of it and just use the wireless charging to keep the phone alive until you decide what your next phone is gonna be. So there's so many uses for wireless charging. I really don't understand why non-flagship phones don't all have this feature. And although it's not a surprise because pretty much no phone in this price range has it, I'm still counting it as a con because the reasoning just still doesn't make sense to me. But those were my pros and cons for the T-Mobile Revvl V Plus 5G. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you found this information useful as well. If you want to learn more about the phone, don't forget to check out my full review on the channel. And as always, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys in the next video.